the deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation and former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, mocked American President Donald Trump after Trump issued a so-called 50-day ultimatum to Russia and the country's allies who continue economic cooperation with Putin's regime. Medvedev called Trump's statements a decorative ultimatum and emphasized that the American president had disappointed belligerent Europe. Indeed, in the Russian capital, little attention was paid to the latest statements by the American president. Moreover, the Moscow Stock Exchange went up after Trump finished his meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, during which those statements were made. However, are Trump's statements really so harmless for the Russian leadership? And is it truly appropriate for Medvedev, who has already publicly retracted his statements several times following comments from American and Western politicians? By the way, the very same has also happened with Trump to openly laugh at the American president. 50 days is indeed quite a long period, which allows the Russian Federation to continue its offensive against Ukrainian positions without any serious problems, as well as to systematically shell Ukrainian cities and towns, thereby destroying Ukraine's military-industrial complex and forcing Ukrainian citizens to consider capitulating to Russia, something Putin continues to count on. But on the other hand, Trump emphasizes that he will provide Ukraine with new weapons. These weapons, of course, are meant to deter the Russian offensive, which, even without them, already appears practically unfeasible given the current position of the armed forces of the Russian Federation on Ukrainian soil. The supply of new air defense systems to Ukraine also creates problems for further shelling of Ukrainian territory by the Russian invaders. And now Western media are emphasizing that the United States may allow Ukraine to strike deep into Russia with ATACMS missiles, which are already in service with Ukraine's defense forces even without this permission. Thus, numerous vital military installations and critical energy facilities throughout the Russian Federation may very soon be set ablaze, which of course will inevitably create significant additional problems for the Russian economy, an economy already severely exhausted by the ongoing international sanctions and the protracted war. Of course, one might think that this economy has already withstood the most serious sanctions pressure from the West, and now Putin, in alliance with the People's Republic of China, can confidently look toward a military future. However, the promise of a 100% tariff for countries that continue to purchase oil from the Russian Federation does indeed create certain problems for the Russian energy sector. Russia remains a country whose budget is primarily tied to the supply of energy resources, and any problems with such supplies reduce the capabilities of the Russian budget and Putin's plans for a years-long war against Ukraine. Until this speech by Trump, the greatest ally of the Russian president was not even China, but time itself. It was precisely this years-long war of attrition against Ukraine, as the Russian president reasoned, that would sooner or later put an end to the history of the neighboring state and allow him to annex Ukrainian territories to Russia as ordinary regions of the Russian Federation, which in turn would make it possible to move on to restoring the borders of the former Soviet Union, which would become the borders of the new Russia. But now, at this very moment, when the Russian Federation may simply not have enough financial resources or sufficient money for this ambitious imperialist experiment of its second president, Vladimir Putin, it will also have to seriously consider whether the Russian Federation itself might ultimately share the unfortunate fate of the former Soviet Union. The Soviet leaders became so engrossed in the arms race with the United States and other Western countries that they failed to notice how the history of their criminal misanthropic state was coming to an end. Although, I would like to remind you, even the leaders of the Western world at that time did not expect such an outcome. They were prepared for continued confrontation with the communist system. It is clear that both Ronald Reagan, François Mitterrand, and Margaret Thatcher wanted to coexist with a more predictable Soviet Union, rather than see the collapse of the communist empire and the greatest crisis it had faced practically since the Bolsheviks' victory in the 1920s. Putin and Medvedev's Russian Federation may face the same inglorious fate. Donald Trump clearly would like to force the Russian president into a compromise and a halt to military actions in Ukraine, and he emphasizes that he is determined to do so. But in reality, the American president is simply dragging the Russian leadership into a new arms race with the West and a struggle to prove that no one will ever dictate anything to Russia. Putin may choose exactly the Brezhnev-Andropov tactic in dealing with the US leadership: to continue ramping up his offensive in Ukraine, to keep shelling Ukrainian territory, and to ignore Trump's ultimatums, which the Kremlin considers merely decorative. The American president will continue to be seen by Putin either as someone who can simply be outmaneuvered, thus creating favorable conditions for himself to continue the war against the Ukraine he so despises, or as someone to simply ignore when Trump issues his warnings. And Trump will escalate his statements about Russia and actions regarding aid to Ukraine, hoping that sooner or later the Russian political leadership will realize the importance of reaching a compromise with Washington. But that compromise will not happen. There will be an escalation of war and crisis in the post-Soviet space. Putin will look for Trump's weak spots, not only when it comes to the Russian-Ukrainian war, but also in other regions of the world. Russia will increase its cooperation with Iran and North Korea in order to create new crises for the United States. And Trump will respond to these challenges from Putin. And eventually, the Russian economy may not withstand this frantic pace of confrontation. And during the time of either Trump or his successor, a crisis may begin in the post-Soviet space that could be compared to the crisis of the former Soviet Union. A crisis that could engulf not only Russia itself, but also other former Soviet republics, which will either be drawn into confrontation with Russia, like Ukraine, or remain in the shadow of its ambitions, like Belarus. And in this situation, the outcomes of such a crisis will be very difficult to predict, just as it was hard at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s to foresee the results of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Thank you, friends. Stay tuned to this channel and subscribe to it. Subscribe to my social media, to the channel on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatello, which help us develop these resources. Make use of the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Wishing you victory and peace. Good luck.